The hills of Blue Ridge, North Carolina rolled like a never-ending tide, their quiet beauty belying the corruption that festered beneath the town's surface. Ethan Marshall gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan, his knuckles white. He had been a cop long enough to know that the worst evil often wore the most ordinary mask. Blue Ridge's precinct wasn't just troubled, it was toxic, and he was here to clean it up. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting its golden glow over the stone facade of the precinct building. To anyone else, it might have seemed like just another day in just another small town. But for Ethan, it was a battlefield waiting to erupt. Pulling into the far end of the lot, he adjusted the rearview mirror and stared at the man reflected back at him. His plaid shirt was rumpled, his jeans worn, and the baseball cap pulled low over his face. This wasn't how a police chief was supposed to look, but that was the point. Today, Ethan Marshall wasn't a chief, he was an observer. He stepped out of the car, the faint scent of rain hanging in the humid air. The building loomed ahead, its facade worn and unassuming, but Ethan knew better than to trust appearances. Blue Ridge's reputation had preceded it, whispers of brutality, cover-ups, and a precinct that answered to anyone but its community. He had been warned not to take the job, but he had never been one to back away from a fight. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, striding toward the side entrance. The door creaked as it opened, and the precinct's dimly lit interior swallowed him whole. The precinct buzzed with activity, but no one gave Ethan a second glance as he moved down the hall. That was the idea. He paused near a bulletin board cluttered with flyers and announcements. The sharp smell of coffee and disinfectant hung in the air as he scanned the precinct, taking in every detail. The break room was alive with chatter. A group of officers clustered near the vending machines, their laughter cutting through the quiet hum of the precinct. At the center of the group stood Officer Daniels, broad-shouldered and cocky, his badge catching the light as he gestured animatedly. Ethan stepped closer, pretending to read a flyer about retirement plans. His stomach tightened. This was the kind of dynamic he had seen too many times before. A dominant personality commanding attention, a group of enablers laughing at every crude joke. "Hey you!" Daniels barked, his voice cutting through the room. Ethan turned slowly, his face neutral. Daniels sauntered over, his grin sharp and predatory. "You lost or something? This isn't a shelter." Ethan said nothing, letting the moment stretch. Daniels stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Or are you just another stray? You need to take your sorry ass out of here before I make you regret it." The room erupted in laughter. Daniels's audience leaned against the wall, their amusement loud and unrestrained. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. Daniels spat, the warm saliva striking Ethan's cheek. A collective gasp followed, quickly replaced by muffled laughter. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief. He wiped his face slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving Daniels. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Ethan asked, his voice low and steady. Daniels smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong." Ethan said nothing more. He turned and walked out of the room, his jaw tight. The laughter followed him down the hall, but he didn't let it reach him. Not yet. The precinct's intercom crackled, summoning all personnel to the briefing room. Ethan made his way there slowly, allowing the adrenaline from the encounter to settle. By the time he entered, the room was already buzzing with chatter. Captain Harris stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. The man's broad frame and graying mustache gave him an air of authority, but his eyes betrayed unease. He cleared his throat as the last officers trickled in. "All right, listen up," Harris barked. "As you all know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today, we welcome his replacement." Ethan stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the now silent room. Daniels leaned against the back wall, his smirk fading as Ethan took the podium. "My name is Ethan Marshall," Ethan began, his voice steady. "As of today, I am your new chief of police." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Daniels stiffened, his face reddening. Ethan's gaze swept the crowd, landing briefly on each officer. "When I arrived this morning," he continued, "I came in plain clothes. I wanted to see this department for what it is, without the filters of ceremony or pretense. What I witnessed was unacceptable." The room grew still, the weight of his words pressing down like a storm cloud. "Respect is not optional," Ethan said, his tone firm. "It is the foundation of law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we swore to protect." He let the silence hang, his gaze locking on Daniels. "The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today. The precinct had been quieter since the briefing. Officers kept their heads down, their usual banter replaced with tense murmurs. The presence of Ethan Marshall, the new chief who had already suspended Officer Daniels, loomed like an unspoken storm. But Ethan wasn't interested in temporary silence. He was interested in systemic change. It started with the files. Ethan spent his first week combing through decades of case reports and internal complaints, a mountain of paperwork that painted a grim picture of Blue Ridge's police department. The complaints were there: excessive force, mishandled evidence, and suspiciously consistent patterns of targeting certain neighborhoods. But for every damning report, there was a corresponding rubber stamp of dismissal, no further action. He found himself drawn to one name that appeared again and again in the reports: Garrison Development Corporation, a company known for its aggressive real estate acquisitions and high-end development projects. Evictions, arrests, and neighborhood transformations often coincided with their movements. Late one night, as the precinct emptied, Ethan found a locked filing cabinet in a storage room. The key was nowhere to be found, so he picked the lock himself, the soft click echoing in the quiet space. Inside were files marked internal use only. Ethan opened the first folder and froze. It contained memos and directives that outlined coordinated efforts to clean up specific neighborhoods. Officers were instructed to patrol these areas more aggressively, issuing fines, making arrests, and encouraging compliance. The targeted neighborhoods were all low-income, predominantly minority communities, and they were all now Garrison properties. Ethan wasn't surprised when Maya Reyes knocked on his door later that week. She was a young officer, barely a year into the job, but he'd noticed her watching him during the briefing. There was a quiet determination in her eyes, one that hinted at someone unwilling to let the status quo persist. "Chief," she said hesitantly, stepping into his office. Her hands clutched a manila envelope. "I found these in the records room. I thought you should see them." Ethan opened the envelope. Inside were copies of emails and memos, similar to the ones he had found in the locked cabinet. But these were more explicit, detailing meetings between Garrison executives and precinct officials. Payments were disguised as donations, and officers were referred to as assets. Maya shifted nervously as Ethan scanned the documents. "I'm not sure who to trust," she admitted. "A lot of people here. They think this is just how things are done." Ethan met her gaze, his tone firm. "You did the right thing, Officer Reyes. But this is going to get messy. Are you ready for that?" She nodded, though her hands trembled. "I joined the force to make a difference, not to be part of this." The deeper Ethan dug, the clearer it became that Captain Harris wasn't just complicit, he was a key player. The memos bore his signature, and his name appeared in several of the emails as the precinct's main point of contact with Garrison. Ethan called Harris into his office one morning, the tension in the room thick as the older man sat across from him. "I want you to explain this," Ethan said, sliding the documents across the desk. Harris barely glanced at them before leaning back in his chair. "You've been busy, Chief." "Answer the question," Ethan snapped. Harris sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Look, I've been here a long time. Garrison's been a part of this town for decades. They fund programs, donate equipment, and yeah, sometimes they ask for favors. That's just how it works." "No," Ethan said sharply. "That's how corruption works. You used your badge to serve them, not the community." Harris's face hardened. "You think you can change this place overnight? You don't know how deep this runs." "Then enlighten me," Ethan said. "Because I'm not stopping until I've cut this out at the root." Harris stared at him for a long moment before leaning forward. "You want the truth? Fine. Garrison owns half this town. Politicians, businesses, hell, even some of the judges. They don't just own the precinct, they own Blue Ridge. If you're interested, don't forget to subscribe and like it." It wasn't long before Ethan realized someone in the precinct was leaking information. Reports went missing, meetings were rescheduled without notice, and Maya Reyes's locker was broken into. Then, late one evening, Ethan reviewed security footage from the records room. His stomach dropped as the grainy black and white images revealed Sergeant Miller, an officer Ethan had thought he could trust, handing a folder to a man in a suit. The man was later identified as a Garrison executive. Ethan confronted Miller the next day, the betrayal burning in his chest. "Why?" Ethan demanded, slamming a file onto his desk. "Why are you working with them?" Miller's face paled. "I didn't have a choice," he stammered. "They've got dirt on everyone. If I didn't cooperate, they'd ruin me." Ethan's voice was cold. "You just ruined yourself." After confronting Sergeant Miller, Ethan's suspicion of the precinct grew sharper. He trusted only a few individuals, Maya Reyes among them, but the weight of isolation pressed heavily on him. The consequences of his fight were becoming more personal. One evening, as he left the precinct, Ethan approached his car and stopped cold. The windshield was shattered, and the words, "Mind your business," were spray-painted across the hood. He scanned the darkened lot, his pulse quickening. Whoever had done this was sending a clear message. The threats escalated in the days that followed. Anonymous notes appeared on his desk, and his phone rang with silent calls at all hours. Once, a dark SUV trailed him as he drove home, its headlights a menacing glare in his rearview mirror. Ethan reported the incidents to state authorities, but their response was predictably slow. Maya, sensing the strain on her chief, approached him late one evening. "They're trying to scare you," she said softly. "They're doing a damn good job of it," Ethan admitted, though his tone was firm. "But I'm not backing down." 2 days later, an unmarked envelope appeared on Ethan's desk. Inside was a USB drive with no accompanying note. Ethan locked his office door and inserted the drive into his computer, his stomach tight with anticipation. What he found was a trove of emails, spreadsheets, and meeting notes. The files laid bare the scope of Garrison's influence. Bribes to council members, payouts to officers, and detailed plans for evictions disguised as urban redevelopment. But one name stood out, Captain Harris. The documents linked Harris to a slush fund used to pay off officers and silence whistleblowers. Ethan's chest tightened as he scrolled through the files. Harris hadn't just been complicit. He'd orchestrated much of the precinct's cooperation with Garrison. The discovery left Ethan reeling. He had suspected Harris was involved, but the depth of his betrayal was staggering. Ethan knew he had to confront him again, but this time, the stakes were even higher. Ethan found Harris at a small diner on the outskirts of Blue Ridge. The older man looked worn, his once imposing frame slouched over a cup of coffee. He didn't seem surprised to see Ethan slide into the booth across from him. "You don't give up, do you?" Harris said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I've seen the files," Ethan said, his tone clipped. "The slush fund, the payouts. You weren't just involved, you ran the whole damn operation." Harris sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said quietly. "When Garrison first approached us, they offered to help. New equipment, better funding. We didn't realize the strings attached until it was too late." "You had a choice," Ethan said, his voice rising. "You could have stopped it." Harris's eyes flashed with anger. "You think it's that simple? Garrison doesn't just threaten, they destroy. Careers, families, lives. You fight them, and they ruin you. And you let them ruin this town instead." Ethan shot back. Harris fell silent, his gaze dropping to the table. After a long pause, he said, "There's something you need to know. They're planning a meeting, big players, not just the precinct. It's happening soon." "Where?" Ethan demanded. Harris hesitated before answering. "An old warehouse on the east side of town. Midnight. But be careful, Marshal. You're not just poking a hornet's nest, you're stepping into it. If you're interested, don't forget to subscribe and like it." Ethan prepared meticulously for the warehouse operation. He coordinated with state authorities, ensuring a tactical team would be on standby. But the risk was immense. If the meeting went sideways, it could cost him everything. The warehouse was shrouded in darkness when Ethan arrived, his heart pounding as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of rust and oil, the faint sound of murmured voices echoing through the cavernous space. He stayed in the shadows, observing the scene. A dozen figures gathered in a loose circle, their postures tense. Among them, Ethan recognized Lieutenant Carter, a senior officer who had been cordial but distant since Ethan's arrival. Carter was speaking to a man in a tailored suit, his voice low but authoritative. "This is bigger than the precinct," Carter said. "We need to act fast before Marshall burns it all down." Ethan's blood ran cold. Carter wasn't just involved, he was a ringleader. The conversation continued, and Ethan's stomach twisted as he heard the details. They weren't just planning to rebuild Garrison's operations, they were discussing cleanup efforts to silence potential threats, including Ethan himself. Before Ethan could react, one of the men turned, his eyes locking onto the shadows where Ethan stood. "Who's there?" the man barked, reaching for a weapon. Ethan stepped into the light, his badge held high. "This meeting is over," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Chaos erupted. Several men bolted for the exits, while others drew weapons. Before anyone could fire, the warehouse doors burst open, and the tactical teams stormed in, shouting commands. Within minutes, the conspirators were subdued, Their plans dismantled in one swift operation. The arrests sent shockwaves through Blue Ridge. Lieutenant Carter and several high-ranking officers were taken into custody, their roles in the conspiracy laid bare. The fallout was swift and brutal, with resignations and firings decimating the precinct's ranks. Captain Harris, though not present at the warehouse, turned himself in the following day. His confession provided additional evidence, sealing the case against Garrison and its collaborators. The community's reaction was mixed. Some saw Ethan as a hero, a man willing to take on the corruption that had plagued their town for years. Others viewed him with suspicion, wary of trusting the institution that had failed them for so long. Ethan worked tirelessly to rebuild that trust. He held public forums, listened to grievances, and implemented sweeping reforms within the precinct. Maya Reyes was promoted to a leadership role, her bravery during the investigation earning her the respect of her peers. Months later, the precinct was a different place. The toxic culture that had once defined it was giving way to a new ethos of accountability and integrity. Officers like Maya set the tone, ensuring the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. Ethan stood in the precinct's main hallway one evening, watching as officers filed out after their shifts. The laughter and camaraderie felt different now, genuine, inclusive. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Maya. "Thank you for fighting, Chief. We're just getting started." Ethan smiled faintly. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time he believed they had a chance. Even with the arrests made and Garrison Development Corporation dismantled, the shadow of its influence lingered over Blue Ridge. The town had spent years under the control of corrupt forces, and that kind of damage couldn't be undone overnight. Ethan Marshall knew this better than anyone. Sitting at his desk late one evening, Ethan stared at a list of names. Officers still under review, precinct officials implicated in cover-ups, and politicians who had yet to face justice. The battle felt endless, a hydra with heads that regrew faster than he could cut them off. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Maya Reyes. "Chief," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "You need to see this. If you're interested, don't forget to subscribe and like it." Maya handed Ethan a folder when he arrived at the precinct. Inside were documents that had been recovered from Garrison's raid, a set of contracts outlining deals with a shadowy group called Greystone Partners. The name hadn't appeared in earlier investigations, but the implications were clear. Garrison wasn't working alone. They were outsourcing, Maya explained. Greystone handled their more delicate operations, intimidation, bribery, even physical threats. Ethan felt the familiar weight of dread settling in his chest. Just as one battle ended, another loomed. If Garrison had been the face of corruption, Greystone was its hidden hand. And worse, it appeared they had already started moving to fill the vacuum left behind. Ethan called a meeting the next morning with his remaining trusted officers. He laid the new evidence on the table, the tension in the room palpable. "This isn't over," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. "Greystone isn't just a local problem. They're bigger, more connected, and more dangerous. But we're not backing down." Maya spoke up, her voice filled with conviction. "We took Garrison down. We can do the same to them." Ethan nodded. "We'll need to be smarter this time. No leaks, no mistakes. This is our line in the sand." The investigation into Greystone Partners proved even more challenging than Garrison. Unlike Garrison, which operated openly under the guise of legitimacy, Greystone was a ghost. No official offices, no registered executives, just a network of shell companies and untraceable accounts. Ethan and Maya worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of evidence. Whistleblowers began to emerge, their testimonies painting a picture of a sprawling operation that extended beyond Blue Ridge, into neighboring towns and even state politics. But with every step forward, the danger grew. Anonymous threats became more explicit, targeting not just Ethan but also Maya and other officers involved in the investigation. One night, a Molotov cocktail was thrown through the window of the precinct. No one was injured, but the message was clear. Greystone wasn't afraid to escalate. Amid the chaos, an unexpected ally came forward. Captain Harris, now serving time for his role in the Garrison scandal, reached out through his lawyer. He offered to provide information on Greystone in exchange for a reduced sentence. Ethan visited Harris in prison, his emotions a mix of anger and hope. The man who had once betrayed the badge now claimed to hold the key to dismantling a greater evil. "They're worse than Garrison," Harris said, his voice low. "More ruthless, more organized. I didn't deal with them directly, but I can tell you where to start. Harris's information led Ethan to a small town outside Blue Ridge, where Greystone operated a covert headquarters. It was the break they needed, but it came with risks. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Greystone had eyes everywhere. Ethan and Maya devised a plan to expose Greystone. It involved setting a trap, luring their key operatives into a meeting with a fabricated deal that would appear too good to pass up. The plan required precision and secrecy. One wrong move, and the entire operation could unravel. The meeting was set at an abandoned industrial site, its remote location ideal for the sting. Ethan coordinated with state authorities, ensuring backup was on standby. Ethan arrived at the site first, his nerves steeled but his pulse quickening. The Greystone representatives arrived shortly after, their black SUVs gleaming under the moonlight. The men who stepped out were sharp-dressed and cold-eyed, their presence exuding quiet menace. The negotiation began smoothly, Ethan playing the part of a willing partner. But as the conversation continued, the Greystone operatives grew suspicious. One of them leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "You're not who you say you are you?" Ethan's hand hovered near his concealed weapon. Before he could respond, the tactical team swept in, lights flashing and commands ringing through the air. The Greystone operatives were caught off guard, their escape routes cut off. The operation was a success, but Ethan's relief was tempered by the realization that this was only a piece of the puzzle. Greystone's leadership remained elusive, their network vast and resilient. Months later, Blue Ridge was beginning to heal. The arrests of Greystone's operatives had sent ripples through the criminal underworld, and the precinct was regaining some semblance of stability. But Ethan knew the fight was far from over. Sitting in his office late one evening, Ethan stared at a map of the region. Red pins marked the towns where Greystone still operated, a stark reminder of the battles yet to come. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was Maya. "Chief," she said, her voice carrying a rare note of optimism. "We just got word," another whistleblower came forward. "We're not done yet." Ethan smiled faintly. The fight was long, grueling, and often thankless, but for the first time he allowed himself a moment of hope. Blue Ridge wasn't perfect, but it was changing, and that was enough. If you found this interesting, be sure to subscribe to the channel and listen to the full story. And if you've seen or experienced something similar, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. All the best to you.